Alright, so we're about to start Act 3, Scene 2. And previously, the women in the play have convinced Beatrice that Benedick loves her. And the men in the play have convinced Benedick that Beatrice loves him. And now the two have decided that they will love each other. And so we now rejoin Don Pedro, Claudio, Benedick and Leonato in Leonato's house. So Act 3, Scene 2 starts as thus. Don Pedro says, "I do but stay till your marriage be consummate, and then I go toward Aragon." And Claudio replies, "I'll bring you thither, my lord, if you'll vouchsafe me." And Don Pedro says, "Nay, that would be as great a soil in the new gloss of your marriage as to show a child his new coat and forbid him to wear it. I will only be bold with Benedick for his company, for from the crown of his head to the sole of his foot he is all mirth. He hath twice or thrice cut Cupid's bowstring, and the little hangman dare not shoot at him. He hath a heart as sound as a bell, and his tongue is the clapper, for what his heart thinks, his tongue speaks." So Claudio, despite the fact he's intending to marry the love of his life, Hero, in a day's time, is saying, "Sure, I'll take you to Aragon." So he's already forgetting that he's got this wife of his, or he would have this wife. Benedick says, "Gallants, I am not as I have been." And Leonato says, "So say I. Methinks you are sadder." And Claudio says, "I hope he be in love." Don Pedro then says, "Hang him, truant, there's no true drop of blood in him to be truly touched with love. If he be sad, he wants money." And Benedick says, "I have the toothache." Don Pedro says, "Draw it." Benedick, "Hang it." Claudio, "You must hang it first and draw it afterwards." And Don Pedro, "What sigh for the toothache?" And Leonato, "Where is but a humour or a worm?" Benedick, "Well, everyone can master a grief but he that has it." And Claudio says, "Yet say I, he is in love." Obviously, the guys know what's going on at this point. Benedick is the only one out of the loop. The rapport between these three is always amusing. The way the words flow from one to the other. The rhythm of it. "I have the toothache. Draw it. Hang it. You must hang it first. Draw it afterwards. What sigh for the toothache?" And so on. And then Claudio has just said, "Yet say I, he is in love." And Don Pedro says, "There is no appearance of fancy in him, unless it be a fancy that he hath two strange disguises, as to be a Dutchman today, a Frenchman tomorrow, or in the shape of two countries at once, as a German from the waist downward, all slops, and a Spaniard from the hip upwards, no doublet. Unless he have a fancy to this foolery, as it appears he hath, he is no fool for fancy, as you would have it appear he is." And Claudio says, "If he be not in love with some woman, there is no believing old signs. Brushes his hat a mornings, what should that bode?" And Don Pedro says, "Hath any man seen him at the barber's?" Claudio, "No, but the barber's man hath been seen with him, and the old ornament of his cheek has already stuffed tennis balls." And Leonato, "Indeed, he looks younger than he did by the loss of a beard." And this little comment here about his beard. So Benedick has clearly shaved, or been shaved, and no longer has a beard. And if we think back to what Beatrice was saying earlier about he that hath a beard is more than a youth, he that has no beard is less than a man, and what would she do with either? She doesn't want a man with a beard, she doesn't want a man without a beard. And now we see that Benedick is fulfilling both those roles. He could have a beard, but he's chosen not to have a beard. And so maybe that is calling back onto Beatrice's comments earlier. So carrying on, Leonato said, "Indeed, he looks younger than he did by the loss of a beard." Don Pedro, "Nay, rubs himself with civet. Can you smell him out by that?" Claudio, "That's as much as to say the sweet youth's in love." Don Pedro, "The greatest note of it is his melancholy." And Claudio, "And when was he wont to wash his face?" Don Pedro, "Yea, or paint himself, for the which I hear what they say of him." And Claudio, "Nay, but his jesting spirit, which is now crept into lute string, and now governed by stops." Don Pedro says, "Indeed, that tells a heavy tale for him. Conclude, conclude, he is in love." And they've listed a bunch of traditional signs of someone being in love, those that were used in plays and scripts and stories around when this was written to show someone in love, much like the Claudio and Hero love story that's playing out. We've got these traditional romances, and he's saying the melancholy, the fact that he's trying to pretty himself up. So they've decided he's in love, which obviously they've planted in the first place. And so Claudio then says, "Nay, but I know who loves him," starting to tease him. And Don Pedro says, "That would I know too. I warrant one that knows him not." And Claudio, "Yes, and his ill conditions, and despite of it all dies for him." Don Pedro, "She shall be buried with her face upwards." I don't understand that reference, and I've seen it in plays, and it doesn't even make sense to me given the context of a play either. And Benedick says, "Yet is this no charm for the toothache. O Signor, walk aside with me. I have studied 8 or 9 wise words to speak to you, which these hobby horses must not hear." And so Benedick and Leonato then leave at that point. So Benedick is unwilling to be honest with his friends about what he is thinking and feeling. His friends are continuing this ruse of Beatrice loves him and pretending that they don't know that Benedick overheard them. And then we are left with Don Pedro and Claudio. And Don Pedro says, "For my life to break with him about Beatrice." And Claudio, "'Tis even so. Hero and Margaret have by this played their parts with Beatrice, and then the 2 bears will not bite one another when they meet." And now Don John enters. And Don John says, "My lord and brother, God save you." And Don Pedro, "Good den, brother." And Don John, "If your leisure served, I would speak with you." And Don Pedro says, "In private." And Don John, "If it please you, yet Count Claudio may hear, for what I would speak of concerns him." So now Don John's plan is about to begin. And Don Pedro says, "What's the matter, Don John?" Speaking to Claudio at this point, "Means your lordship to be married tomorrow?" Obviously, everybody knows by this point, so it's not a subtle start to what he's after. And Don Pedro says, "You know he does, Don John. I know not that when he knows what I know." The classic "I know something you don't know" taunt to draw someone in. Claudio, "If there be any impediment, I pray you discover it." And Don John says, "You may think I love you not. Let that appear hereafter, and aim better at me by that I now will manifest. For my brother, I think he holds you well, and in dearness of heart hath holp to effect your ensuing marriage. Surely suit ill spent and labour ill bestowed." And Don Pedro says, "Why? What's the matter?" So Don John is milking this by this point. There's no need for all this build up to what he has to say. And yet he is taking his moment to be centre of attention. And Don John says, "I came hither to tell you, and circumstance is shortened, for she has been too long a talking of. The lady is disloyal." And Claudio says, "Who? Hero?" Don John, "Even she, Leonato's hero, your hero, every man's hero." That is quite a brutal insult for the day and the age of where this is set, and how highly chastity and purity were held, to say Leonato's hero, your hero, every man's hero. It is quite brutal. And Claudio says, "Disloyal." Don John, "The word's too good to paint out her wickedness. I could say she were worse. Think you of a worse title, and I will fit her to it. Wonder not till further warrant. Go but with me tonight. You shall see her chamber window entered, even the night before her wedding day. If you love her then, tomorrow wed her. But it would better fit your honour to change your mind." Claudio says, "May this be so, Don Pedro. I will not think it." And Don John says, "If you dare not trust that you see, confess not that you know. If you will follow me, I will show you enough. And when you have seen more and heard more, proceed accordingly." And Claudio says, "If I see anything tonight why I should not marry her tomorrow, in the congregation where I should wed, there will I shame her. And Don Pedro says, "And as I wooed for thee to obtain her, I will join thee to disgrace her." And Don John says, "I will disparage her no further till you are my witnesses. Bear it coldly but till midnight, and let the issue show itself." Don Pedro says, "O day untowardly turned." Claudio, "O mischief strangely thwarted." Don John, "O plague right well prevented." So will you say when you have seen the sequel. And that's the end of the scene. And so before we continue, I would like to say how trusting and blind Don Pedro and Claudio are being here. We know that Don John is not popular, is considered to be a bad guy, or would be if he had the power to be a bad guy, but he's unhappy and clearly doesn't like Claudio or Don Pedro particularly. And yet they are listening to him and they are trusting him. And what Don John has said is to list exactly what he's anticipating happening that evening. He says, "With me tonight you shall see her chamber window entered even the night before her wedding day." So he's got a script for everything he's expecting to happen this evening. And these two believe that what he said is going to happen. They are willing to go and watch. Now, I don't know about you, but if someone had given me a full list of someone else's behaviour for the evening before it's happened, I would assume that somebody has crafted it, has forced these actions to happen. There's no way to know ahead of time something will happen unless you have caused it to happen yourself. But that might just be me knowing what's happening. It might be that dramatic irony that's built into this. Either way, I still think it's unlikely that Don Pedro and Claudio would trust Don John in such a way. And then on top of that, we've got how brutal Claudio and Don Pedro are. "If I see anything tonight why I should not marry her tomorrow, in the congregation where I should wed, there will I shame her." So it's not I will back out gracefully and try and avoid any embarrassment on myself. No, it's I am going to shame this person who I have professed to love and want to marry in front of absolutely everyone and ruin her. And it's simply anything why I should not marry her. Not just something terrible, but anything at all, and I will shame her in front of everyone. And Don Pedro says, "You know what, I helped you get engaged here, so I'm going to go along with you, and I too will shame her in front of everyone." So these guys are taking their power here, because the men had all the power at this point, and they are being really heavy-handed and unnecessarily brutal in what they consider to be a punishment or their right to do in response to what they are being tricked into thinking in the first place. So it doesn't reflect well on any of the three there, Don John, Don Pedro or Claudio. Alright, so now we've seen Don John's plan put into action, and we move on to a completely different scene. Act 3, Scene 3, which is set in a street, and this is where we are introduced to the Watch. And we meet Dogberry and Verges with the Watch. Now these guys are meant to be the sort of goofy comedic relief. We've got the clever comedic values of Beatrice and Benedick, their sharp wit. And now we've got the idiots, which are the Watch. So you might be used to thinking of the sort of police being somewhat intelligent. They have to pass exams. Certainly these days, police are considered to be educated. Back then, not so much. It was a responsibility that people generally didn't want. So these Watch people wouldn't have been particularly educated and would have been considered quite low. And so let's start and meet Dogberry. So Dogberry starts and he says, "Are you good men and true?" And Verges says, yea, or else it were pity, but they should suffer salvation, body and soul. And Dogberry says, nay, that were a punishment too good for them, if they should have any allegiance in them, being chosen for the prince's watch. So they're trying to give themselves some sense of respectability. They are the prince's watch. And Verges says, well, give them their charge, neighbour Dogberry. And Dogberry says, first, who think you the most desertless man to be constable? We hear throughout Dogberry's speeches these malapropisms by misusing words. He's chosen a word with a similar sound in place of the word he really meant, and in general it makes no sense, though you can understand what he actually was aiming for. And so he does this throughout, and he often has a complete opposite meaning to what he's actually said. And so, who think you the most desertless man to be constable? And the first watch says, Hugh Oatcake, sir, or George Seacole, for they can write and read. And Dogberry says, come hither, neighbour Seacole, God hath blessed you with a good name. To be a well-favoured man is a gift of fortune, but to write and read comes by nature, which obviously we know is not true, it's education. And the second watch says, both which, Master Constable. And Dogberry says, you have, I knew it would be your answer. Well, for your favour, sir, why, give God thanks, and make no boast of it. And for your writing and reading, let that appear where there is no need of such vanity. You are thought here to be the most senseless and fit man for the constable of the watch. Therefore bear you the lantern. This is your charge. You shall comprehend all vagrom men. You are to bid any man stand in the prince's name. Again, this false sense of power and respectability in the prince's name, not just in their own name or because they are the watch, but in the prince's name. And the second watch says, how if he will not stand? And Dogberry says, why then, take no note of him, but let him go, and presently call the rest of the watch together, and thank God you are rid of a knave. And Verges says, if he will not stand when he is bidden, he is none of the prince's subjects. And Dogberry says, true, and they are to meddle with none but the prince's subjects. You shall also make no noise in the streets, for the watch to babble and to talk is most tolerable, and not to be endured. And the second watch says, we will rather sleep than talk. We know what belongs to a watch. And Dogberry says, why, you speak like an ancient and most quiet watchman, for I cannot see how sleeping should offend. Only have a care that your bills be not stolen. Well, you are to call to all the alehouses and bid those that are drunk get them to bed. And the second watch says, how if they will not? And Dogberry says, why then, let them alone till they are sober. If they make you not then the better answer, you may say they are not the men you took them for. So everything Dogberry is saying essentially avoids work or confrontation. He has a high value on himself. He is the prince's watch. You have the power to do this, you have the power to do that. But then saying, but we won't actually use the power, let's avoid any actual trouble at all. And the second watch says, well, sir, and Dogberry says, if you meet a thief, you may suspect him by virtue of your office to be no true man. And for such kind of men, the less you meddle or make with them, why, the more is for your honesty. Again, avoid these criminals. Second watch says, if we know him to be a thief, shall we not lay hands on him? And Dogberry says, truly, by your office you may, but I think they that touch pitch will be defiled. The most peaceable way for you, if you do take a thief, is to let him show himself what he is and steal out of your company. And Verges says, you have been always called a merciful man, partner. And Dogberry says, truly, I would not hang a dog by my will, much more a man who hath any honesty in him. And so this lends a slightly different slant to what Dogberry's been saying. All the way so far, he's been saying, avoid them, let them go, they're not your problem. And now perhaps we are hearing that really Dogberry just doesn't actually want to get anyone in trouble. The laws back then and the punishments back then were probably more black and white as to the type of punishment they would get. And Dogberry has no intention of causing someone else to be put in that position. So perhaps there's a kinder heart than is being shown here. Rather than this avoidance of work, it's the avoidance of causing someone else discomfort. So, carrying on, Verges says, if you hear a child cry in the night, you must call to the nurse and bid her still it. And the second watch says, how if the nurse be asleep and will not hear us? Dogberry then tells them, why then depart in peace, and let the child wake her with crying. For the ewe that will not hear the lamb when it bays will never answer a calf when he bleats. Verges says, 'tis very true, and Dogberry, this is the end of the charge. You, constable, are to present the prince's own person. If you meet the prince in the night, you may stay him. And Verges says, nay, dear lady, that I think he cannot. And Dogberry says, 5 shillings to 1 on with any man that knows the statutes. He may stay him. Marry not without the prince be willing, for indeed the watch ought to offend no man, and it is an offence to stay a man against his will. Verges says, by a lady, I think it be so. Dogberry says, ha ha! Well, masters, good night, and there be any matter of weight chances, call up me. Keep your fellows' counsels and your own, and good night. Come, neighbour. And the second watch says, well, masters, we hear our charge, let us go sit here upon the church bench till 2, and then all to bed. And Dogberry says, one more word, honest neighbours, I pray you. Watch about Signor Leonato's door, for the wedding being there tomorrow, there is a great coil tonight. Adieu, be vigilant, I beseech you. And then Dogberry and Verges exit, and Borachio and Conrad enter. And Borachio says, what, Conrad? And the watch says, without them hearing, peace, stir not. And Borachio says, Conrad, I say. Conrad replies, here, man, I am at thy elbow. Borachio says, mass, and my elbow itched, I thought there would a scab follow. And Conrad says, I will owe thee an answer for that, and now forward with thy tale. And Borachio says, stand thee close then under this penthouse, for it drizzles rain, and I will, like a true drunkard, utter all to thee. And so the watch, who are also there, but unseen and quiet, say to each other, some treason. Masters, yet stand close. And Borachio says, therefore know, I have earned of Don John 1,000 ducats. And Conrad says, is it possible that any villainy should be so dear? And Borachio says, thou shouldst rather ask if it were possible any villainy should be so rich, for when rich villains have need of poor ones may make what price they will. And Conrad says, I wonder at it. Borachio then continues, that shows thou art unconfirmed. Thou knowest that the fashion of a doublet or a hat or a cloak is nothing to a man. And Conrad says, yes, it is apparel. Borachio says, I mean the fashion. And Conrad says, yes, the fashion is the fashion. And Borachio says, tush, I may as well say the fool's the fool. But seest thou not what a deformed thief this fashion is? And the watch, still unheard, say, I know that deformed has been a vile thief this 7 years. A goes up and down like a gentleman. I remember his name. And Borachio says, didst thou hear somebody? Conrad, no, 'twas the vane on the house. Borachio says, seest thou not? I say what a deformed thief this fashion is. How giddily he turns about all the hot bloods between 14 and 5 and 30. Sometime fashioning them like Pharaoh's soldiers in the Ricci painting, sometimes like God-Bel's priests in the old church window, sometimes like the shaven Hercules in the smirched worm-eaten tapestry, where his codpiece seems as massy as his club. And Conrad says, all this I see, and I see that the fashion wears out more apparel than the man. But art not thou thyself giddy with the fashion too, that thou hast shifted out of thy tale into telling me of the fashion? So that whole speech about fashion and appearance is very much along the lines of how to deceive, how to make yourself appear something you aren't. Other than that, I've no idea what that whole Borachio chat about fashion really is about. And so, after Conrad's prompting, Borachio continues to say, "Not so neither, but know that I have tonight wooed Margaret, the Lady Hero's gentlewoman, by the name of Hero. She leans me out of her mistress's chamber window, bids me 1,000 times good night. I tell this tale vilely. I should first tell thee how the prince, Claudio, and my master, planted and placed and possessed by my master Don John, saw afar off in the orchard this amiable encounter." And Conrad said, "And thought they Margaret was Hero?" Borachio says, "2 of them did, the prince and Claudio, but the devil my master knew she was Margaret, and partly by his oaths, which first possessed them, partly by the dark night which did deceive them, but chiefly by my villainy, which did confirm any slander that Don John had made, away went Claudio enraged, swore he would meet her, as he was appointed, next morning at the temple, and there, before the whole congregation, shame her with what he saw all night, and send her home again without a husband." So it sounds like Borachio and Don John's plan has completely fallen into place. And like I mentioned when it was first discussed, the idea that Margaret would go along with this, would have no issue being called Hero, and being in Hero's room and talking to Borachio in such a way is very strange. Like, what kind of person is Margaret that this makes sense to her without knowing what's going on behind the scenes? I don't understand at all. But it's worked, and we hear that Claudio and Don Pedro have seen this as well, and they are now convinced that Hero was the person in that room. And so after this speech, the first watcher there saying, "We charge you in the prince's name, stand." And the second watcher there saying, "Call up the right master constable. We have here recovered the most dangerous piece of lechery that ever was known in the Commonwealth." The first watchman says, "And one deformed is one of them. I know him, and wears a lock." And Conrad says, "Masters, masters." And the second watchman says, "You'll be made bring deformed forth, I warrant you." Conrad says, "Masters." And the first watch says, "Never speak, we charge you, let us obey you to go with us." And Borachio says, "We are like to prove a goodly commodity being taken up of these men's bills." And Conrad says, "A commodity in question, I warrant you. Come, we'll obey you." So these watchmen, who, although they've been told to basically avoid any actual trouble or people going against the law, have taken Conrad and Borachio based on what they've just heard. So that was the end of Act 3, Scene 3, and we move on to Act 4, which is in Leonato's house, and we have Hero, Margaret, and Ursula. So Hero is saying, "Good Ursula, wake my cousin Beatrice and desire her to rise." Ursula says, "I will, lady." And Hero says, "And bid her come hither." Ursula says, "Well," and leaves. And Margaret continues saying, "Troth, I think your other rabato were better." Hero says, "No, pray thee, good Meg, I'll wear this." Margaret, "By my troths, not so good. I warrant your cousin will say so." And Hero says, "My cousin's a fool, and thou art another. I'll wear none but this." And Margaret says, "I like the new tire within excellently, if the hair were a thought browner. And your gown's a most rare fashion, in faith. I saw the Duchess of Milan's gown that they praise so." And Hero says, "Oh, that exceeds, they say." And Margaret says, "By my troths, but a nightgown in respect of yours, cloth of gold, and cuts and laced with silver, set with pearls, down sleeves, side sleeves, and skirts round, underborne with a blush tinsel, but for a fine, quaint, graceful, and excellent fashion, yours is worth 10 on't." And Hero says, "God give me joy to wear it, for my heart is exceedingly heavy." And Margaret says, "'Twill be heavier soon by the weight of a man." And Hero says, "Fie upon thee, art not ashamed?" Margaret says, "Of what, lady? Of speaking honourably? Is not marriage honourable in a beggar? Is not your lord honourable without marriage? I think you would have me say, saving your reverence, a husband. And bad thinking do not rest true speaking. I'll offend nobody. Is there any harm in the heavier for a husband? None, I think, and it be the right husband and the right wife. Otherwise 'tis light and not heavy. Ask my Lady Beatrice else. Here she comes. And so we've had a scene there, or a part of a scene, with Margaret in, knowing what we know about what happened the previous night with Margaret and Borachio in Hero's window. And Margaret is, it seems, in no way affected at all. She is going about her daily duties with Hero and soon with Beatrice, and she seems completely unconcerned, completely unknowing of the trouble that she's helped cause. Anyway, Beatrice now enters, and Hero speaks and says, "Good morrow, coz," and Beatrice says, "Good morrow, sweet Hero." And Hero notices Beatrice is out of sorts and says, "Why, how now? Do you speak in the sick tune?" Beatrice says, "I am out of all other tune, methinks." And Margaret says, "Claps into light of love. That goes without a burden. Do you sing it, and I'll dance it." And Beatrice says, "Yea, light of love with your heels. Then if your husband have stables enough, you'll see he shall lack no barns." And Margaret says, "Oh, illegitimate construction, I scorn that with my heels." And Beatrice says, "'Tis almost 5 o'clock, cousin. 'Tis time you are ready. By my troth, I am exceedingly ill, hey-ho." And Margaret says, "For a hawk, a horse, or a husband?" And Beatrice says, "For the letter that begins them all. Ha!" And Margaret says, "Well, and you be not turned tug, there's no more sailing by the star." Beatrice, "What means the fool, trow?" And Margaret, "Nothing I, but God send every one their heart's desire." And Hero says, "These gloves the Count sent me, they are an excellent perfume." Beatrice says, "I am stuffed, cousin, I cannot smell." Margaret says, "A maid and stuffed, there's goodly catching of cold." Now, very early on in the first scene, Beatrice calls Benedick a stuffed man, and now we've come full circle, and now Beatrice is stuffed, and Beatrice says, "Oh, God help me, God help me. How long have you professed apprehension?" And Margaret says, "Ever since you left it, doth not my wit become me rarely?" And Beatrice says, "It is not seen enough. You should wear it in your cap. By my troth, I am sick." And Margaret says, "Get you some of this distilled Cardus Benedictus, and lay it to your heart. It is the only thing for a qualm." And Hero says, "There thou prickst her with a thistle." Beatrice says, "Benedictus, why Benedictus? You have some moral in this Benedictus." And Margaret says, "Moral? No, by my troth, I have no moral meaning. I meant plain holy thistle. You may think, perchance, that I think you are in love. Nay, by your lady, I am not such a fool to think what I list. Nor I list not to think what I can, nor indeed I cannot think, if I would think my heart out of thinking, that you are in love, or that you will be in love, or that you can be in love. Yet Benedick was such another, and now is he become a man. He swore he would never marry, and yet now, in despite of his heart, he eats his meat without grudging. And how you may be converted, I know not. But methinks you look with your eyes as other women do." And Beatrice says, "What pace is this that thy tongue keeps?" Margaret says, "Not a false gallop." At this point Ursula enters, and Ursula says, "Madam, withdraw. The prince, the count, Signor Benedick, Don John, and all the gallants of the town are come to fetch you to church." And Hero says, "Help to dress me, good coz, good Meg, good Ursula." And that is the end of that scene. So Margaret, who hasn't really featured significantly up to this point in the play, more featured in other people's discussion, is clearly quite an intelligent and quick-witted person. She speaks well, and yet somehow she's been caught up in Don John's plan, along with Borachio. Unknowingly, apparently, but there's room here to think that maybe she was part of this, playing all sides. And as a servant, it's perhaps in her interest to play as many different sides as she can and get what she can for herself. So although it's never explicitly said, in fact, quite the opposite, that Margaret was involved in this, I find it more and more difficult to believe that Margaret could be utterly clueless. Anyway, let's move on to Act 3, Scene 5, which is also in Leonato's house in a different room. And so we have Leonato and Dogberry and Verges. So the Watch are speaking to Leonato. And Leonato says, "What would you with me, honest neighbours?" Dogberry says, "Marry, sir, I would have some confidence with you that discerns you nearly." Leonato says, "Brief, I pray you, for you see it is a busy time with me." Dogberry says, "Marry, this it is, sir." Verges, "Yes, in truth it is, sir." And Leonato, "What is it, my good friends?" Dogberry says, "Good man Verges, sir, speaks a little of the matter. An old man, sir, and his wits are not so blunt as God help I would desire they were, but in faith honest as the skin between his brows." Dogberry is infuriatingly long-winded and not concise in how he speaks throughout this. The whole problems that continue from this point on would have been solved if only Dogberry and Verges had actually come to the point and said what they needed to say at this stage. But because they have hired buffoons for the Prince's Watch, it is completely ineffective. And so we carry on. Verges said, "Yes, I thank God I am as honest as any man living. That is an old man, and no honester than I." Dogberry says, "Comparisons are odorous, palabrous, neighbour Verges." And Leonato says, "Neighbours, you are tedious." And Dogberry says, "It pleases your worship to say so, but we are the poor Duke's officers. But truly, for mine own part, if I were as tedious as a king, I could find in my heart to bestow it all on your worship." Which is funny, because he already is being incredibly tedious towards him. And Leonato says, "All thy tediousness on me." Ha! Dogberry says, "Yea, and 'twere 1,000 pound more than 'tis, for I hear as good exclamation on your worship as any man in the city, and though I be but a poor man, I am glad to hear it." Verges says, "And so am I." Leonato, being relatively patient here, says, "I would fain know what you have to say." Verges says, "Marry, sir, our watch tonight, excepting your worship's presence, has taken a couple of as arrant knaves as any in Messina." Dogberry then interrupts and takes the conversation away from where it could have been resolved. Dogberry says, "A good old man, sir, he will be talking. As they say, when the age is in, the wit is out. God help us, it is a world to see." "Well said, in faith, neighbour Verges. Well, God's a good man, and 2 men ride of a horse, 1 must ride behind. An honest soul, in faith, sir. By my troth he is, as ever broke bread. But God is to be worshipped, all men are not alike. Alas, good neighbour." Leonato then says, "Indeed, neighbour, he comes too short of you." And Dogberry says, "Gifts that God gives." Leonato says, "I must leave you." Dogberry says, "One word, sir. Our watch, sir, hath indeed comprehended 2 auspicious persons, and we would have them this morning examined before your worship." Leonato says, "Take their examination yourself, and bring it me. I am now in great haste, as may appear unto you." Dogberry says, "It shall be suffigance." Leonato says, "Drink some wine ere you go. Fare you well." And the messenger enters and says, "My lord, they stay for you to give your daughter to her husband." Leonato says, "I'll wait upon them. I am ready." And Leonato and the messenger leave. Dogberry says, "Go, good partner, go get you to Francis Seacole. Bid him bring his pen and inkhorn to the jail. We are now to examination these men." And Verges says, "And we must do it wisely." Dogberry says, "We will spare no wit, I warrant you. Here's that shall drive some of them to a non-com. Only get the learned writer to set down an excommunication and meet me at the jail." And that ends Act 3. Scene 5. Act 3 in total. And so this whole chunk here with Leonato and the watch, a simple word could have resolved the rest of this play in this single scene here. But as I said, they have for the watch idiots, essentially. People who are not particularly well educated, not particularly well spoken, and yet somehow are thinking quite highly of themselves. And then there's this fact that they have gone to Leonato to describe what's happened. And you would expect the watch to be aware that Hero is Leonato's daughter, that it really does concern him dearly, not discern him nearly, as Dogberry said earlier on. And so you would think that they would have mentioned that it's about Hero. And yet somehow that doesn't come up. And so Leonato is left without knowing what's going on. And Dogberry and Verges go off to examination their captives. Alright, so that was the end of Act 3. So at this point, Don John has done his job, fulfilled his plan and tricked Claudio and Don Pedro into thinking that Hero is having an affair. Margaret has managed to be part of that, supposedly unknowingly, and is now helping Hero prepare for her wedding. Beatrice is feeling completely out of sorts due to the sudden revelation about Benedick's love for her, and is also trying to get Hero ready for her wedding. And Borachio and Conrad have been caught by the watch and are going to be interrogated. So that's where we will leave it. And Act 4 will see us at the wedding.